King Edward Building, London, EC1, Monday morning, February 1932. The sorting halls below are winding down from the night shift. On the third floor, in a room that has no public counter and no public-facing window, a clerk is at his desk by 7:30. The tray in front of him has been waiting since Friday. Not a full tray. This branch does not deal in bulk, the way the sorting frames downstairs do. It deals in the specific cases that the sorting frames could not resolve. Envelopes that arrived at a district sorting office and could not be sent forward because something in the address was wrong. The handwriting reduced to a smear. The street name garbled beyond recognition. The town named in a form that no postal directory in England contained under anything like that spelling. 17 years at this desk. Not the same desk. The branch has moved twice since 1915. But the same work, the same type of tray, the same particular kind of failure in front of him every Monday morning. The letter that someone had posted in the belief that the postal system would know what to do with it, and that the postal system, in all its ordinary competence, had been unable to route. He does not pick up the first envelope immediately. He reads the district endorsement first, the stamp applied at the sorting office that forwarded the item to this branch rather than discarding it. Insufficiently addressed. Returned for better direction. Not known at this address. 3 categories of failure. 3 different problems requiring 3 different kinds of solution. This is not the work you see when you think of the post office. The red van on the morning street is the post office. The postman at the gate with the morning delivery is the post office. The clerk on the 3rd floor of King Edward Building, working through a tray of letters that the rest of the system could not place, is the post office, correcting its own failure, quietly, without ceremony, in a room that most of the people whose letters pass through it will never know existed. What is in the tray? Who posted these letters? And where and to whom? And what did each address say when it left the sender's hand? The returned letter branch was, in its operational function, the residual category of the General Post Office's ordinary promise. Every letter posted in Britain was intended to move through a predictable sequence. Collection, sorting, forwarding, delivery. The system handled hundreds of millions of items each year. It was designed for legibility. For the address written clearly in the top right quarter of the envelope, the street name spelled recognizably, the town named in a form that a district sorter, working at speed through a frame of 1,000 pigeonholes, could assign to the correct outgoing bag in under a second. The returned letter branch existed for the cases where that assumption broke down. Not catastrophically. The failure rate was small in proportion to the total volume. But small in proportion to hundreds of millions of letters was still a significant number of individual correspondences. Letters that a district sorter had picked up, read once and then again, and been unable to assign to any outgoing bag with confidence. When a district sorting office could not route an item, the procedure was clear. The item was not discarded. It was endorsed, stamped with the reason it could not proceed, and forwarded to the returned letter branch. Brought here, added to the tray. 3 endorsement categories covered the range of problems. Insufficiently addressed meant the information on the envelope was present, but not present enough to route with confidence. A street name without a house number, a county without a town, a name without a street. Not known at this address meant the letter had reached its district and been delivered to the address on the envelope, but no one at that address recognized the name. The person had moved, or the name had been miswritten, or the address was correct but applied to the wrong person. Returned for better direction covered the broader residual category. The address that was recognizable in its general form but imprecise enough in its specific detail that the district office could not, in good conscience, forward it without further resolution. Each endorsement told the clerk, before they had examined the envelope's surface more closely, what kind of problem they were working with. And each kind of problem had its own sequence of approaches, its own logic for deciding where to look next. What did the system require of the people in this branch that the ordinary machinery of sorting and forwarding could not provide? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail between 1,900 and 1,980. The vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans. The documented operational reality of a postal system and the specific human meaning of what it delivered before the telephone changed what it meant to wait for news. What the returned letter branch clerk held in their hands was not a piece of failed correspondence. It was a connection that the postal system's ordinary failure had interrupted, and the specific, undramatic skill of their work was what determined whether the interruption was final. And if you remember a letter that arrived with a forwarding stamp, or came back to you before it reached its destination, put it in the comments. Did you ever write or receive a letter that took an unusual route before it arrived? Next on this channel, the women who walked Britain's postal rounds in the First World War, when the postman became the postwoman, and the round did not stop. Back to the desk. The term used inside the postal service was blind reading. It described a specific category of problem. The address that, to an ordinary postal worker reading at sorting speed, was as opaque as if it had been written with eyes closed. Not an address that was simply wrong. Wrong addresses had their own handling procedure. Blind reading was the practice of extracting meaning from an address that appeared, on its surface, to have none. The problems were several. Handwriting was the most common source of failure, not carelessness. The sender had written what seemed to them a perfectly legible address. But individual letter formation varied between writers, and what one person formed as an R, another formed as an N, and a street name that depended on a specific combination of those two letters could be transformed, in transit, into something that matched nothing in the district sorter's reference. A surname written at speed, in which the letters ran together in a way the writer's own hand had produced every day for decades. But that was not the convention for that combination in print, arrived at the sorting office as a puzzle rather than an address. Abbreviations compounded this. A sender writing to a relative in a city they had visited once and remembered imperfectly might write the county name in an abbreviated form that existed in no official postal directory. A trade or occupation mentioned on the envelope. Mr. Thomas, the chemist, at the top of the high street, instead of a numbered address, expecting the local sorting office to know which chemist was meant. The returned letter clerk working through this kind of problem was doing something closer to detection than to sorting. The tools available were straightforward. A reference library of British place names in their standard and non-standard spellings, their county locations, and postal district assignments. The envelope itself, for whatever contextual information survived. A partial postmark, the paper quality, and the accumulated experience of working through precisely this kind of failure, year after year. Occasionally the solution was straightforward. A village name written without its county produced an obvious candidate in the reference. A smudged number that survived in 2 of its 3 digits could be restored by working through the plausible options. Occasionally, it was not straightforward at all, and remained unresolved. The envelope returned, the correspondent never reached. Who posted it? And what did they believe they had written? And what did the person waiting for the reply make of the silence that followed? A letter that ended up in the returned letter branch had, before it arrived, already made a longer journey than most correspondence. It had been posted. It had been collected. It had passed through at least one sorting stage before reaching the point where the postal system's ordinary competence ran out. The sorting operation that preceded the branch's work was designed to move quickly. A sorter at a district frame was working through 1,000 pieces in an hour. The skill was pattern recognition. Town names, street names, district codes, translated into a bag assignment without conscious deliberation. The frame had its pigeonholes labeled. The sorter's hands knew the geography as a physical reflex, not a decision made fresh each time. When that reflex encountered an address, it could not resolve. When the name on the envelope matched nothing in the district frame's geography, or matched something in a way that was ambiguous enough to require a decision the sorter could not, in good conscience, make. The standard procedure was to set the item aside. At the end of the sort, items set aside were reviewed. Some could be resolved on second reading by a senior sorter who knew the district's idiosyncrasies more deeply. Those that could not were endorsed and forwarded. The rural postman who had attempted delivery to a specific door and found that the name matched no one at that address added a different kind of information to the envelope's history. Not known at this address did not mean the envelope had failed in sorting. It had been sorted. It had been carried. It had been presented at a door. It meant the specific correspondence between the name on the envelope and the person living at that address did not exist. The person had moved, or the name had been miswritten, or the intended recipient and the current occupant were not the same person. Each step of the journey left its trace on the envelope. The postmark of the originating office, the endorsement of the district office, the delivery attempt notation of the postman who had carried it to the door. By the time the envelope arrived at the branch's desk, it carried a documentary history of its own failure, and that history was also the first evidence available for the clerk working to reverse it. What did the journey of this particular envelope reveal about where it had come from, and where it might yet be made to go? The power to open a letter was not an ordinary power. In British law, and in the GPO's own procedural framework, the privacy of correspondence was a protected principle. A postman delivering the morning round did not open letters. A sorter at a district frame did not open letters. The postal system handled closed correspondence on the assumption that it would arrive intact, unseen, between sender and recipient. The returned letter branch operated under a different procedural authority, where an envelope could not be returned to its sender, because no return address existed, and could not be forwarded to its intended recipient, because the destination could not be recovered from the address as it appeared on the envelope's exterior. The branch's internal authority permitted the opening of the item in order to search for a destination. The constraint was narrow. The purpose was specific. The task was to find a name, an address, a reference, anything that might restore the letter to its intended route. Not to read the correspondence as a correspondent would read it. Not to assess its content. Not to act on any information found beyond the single task of establishing where the letter was supposed to go. A name, a city, a relative's address mentioned in passing, a workplace, a school, a bank, a military unit, any detail that could return the letter to its route. The clerks who worked this task were senior members of the branch. The procedural record of each opening was maintained. The information that established the forwarding address, if one was found, was noted. The rest of the letter's content was, in the branch's own internal discipline, not the clerk's concern and not their authority. What this produced in the daily work of the branch was a particular discipline of restraint. The clerk working through an opened letter was not reading it, as a correspondent reads a letter. Through its emotional register, its personal detail, the relationship between writer and recipient. They were reading it as a map. Reader reads a map, looking for a specific kind of information, in a specific category, and moving on when it was either found or not found. The letter was a puzzle, whose solution was a postal address, and the clerk's authority extended to the solving of that puzzle and no further. What the letter said, what it carried between the person who wrote it and the person who was supposed to receive it, was not the branch's concern. Its concern was the address alone. For the person who eventually received a letter that had passed through the returned letter branch, the experience was typically invisible. The endorsement stamp was on the envelope. The stamp told a story the recipient might read with curiosity or mild irritation at the delay, without understanding what it represented. That the letter had reached the point where the postal system's ordinary competence had run out, and that what had brought it finally to their door was not the ordinary machinery of sorting and forwarding, but the specific, undramatic skill of someone working through a tray on a desk on the third floor of a building in London, EC1. The delay mattered, in the way that timing always mattered when the letter was the primary means by which news moved between people who could not see each other. A letter returned to its sender and reposted with a corrected address had taken 2 journeys instead of 1. A letter that passed through the branch directly and was forwarded to a recovered destination had taken longer than a correctly addressed letter would have taken. But it had arrived. The difference between arriving late and not arriving at all was the difference between a connection maintained and one broken by a clerical slip, or a careless abbreviation, or an ink smear in a mailbag in wet weather. The branch was the system's correction of that difference. For the sender, the correspondent who had written the letter and posted it and waited for the reply, the branch's work was invisible in the most complete sense. They had sent a letter, and eventually the reply came. The system had, in some way they never needed to understand, worked. For the person who never received a reply, whose letter had been returned to them unforwardable or held because no destination could be established. The experience was the other kind of silence, the reply that did not come, which might have been a silence on the receiving end, or might have been a letter lost somewhere in the postal system's machinery, and which they had no reliable way to distinguish between. What the branch could do was recover the cases where recovery was possible. What it could not do was guarantee that every endorsed envelope would find its way. The limit of the available information was the limit of the branch's skill, and some letters, posted in confidence, addressed in good faith, arrived nowhere, were returned unopened, and left no trace in the correspondence they had been written to answer. The postcode trial in Norwich began in October 1959. The Postmaster General, Ernest Marples, announced the trial. 8 electronic sorting machines were installed at the Norwich sorting office. The electronic letter sorting indicating equipment, ELSI, in the sorting office's own shorthand, and they required a machine-readable code on each envelope, a 6-character alphanumeric designating area, district, and specific address group, keyed in by a machine operator to assign the item to the correct outgoing bag. The trial demonstrated both what the new technology could do and what it required. Less than half of letters posted in Norwich bore the experimental code during the trial period. The machines sorted what they could read and sent the rest to human sorters. The technology worked when the address was correctly formatted, and the problem of the incorrectly formatted address was not solved by the technology's availability. The machine could not read a code that the sender had not written. In October 1965, Postmaster General Tony Benn announced that postal coding was to be extended to the rest of the country. The 8-year program to create a postcode for every address in Britain began at Croydon in 1966. It was completed in 1974 with the recoding of Norwich. The postcode's gradual introduction represented a structural change in the relationship between addresses and the postal system's ability to process them. An address that included a correct postcode could be processed mechanically. An address that did not could be identified and set aside for human handling at the outset, before it had passed through multiple stages of sorting. The categories of postal failure began to shift. As postcodes became standard, as senders learned to include them, as printed correspondence carried them as a matter of routine. The specific failure mode that the branch had existed to address began to change in character. The illegible handwritten street name remained a problem. The incorrect house number remained a problem. But the partial address that had required a senior clerk's 17 years of knowledge of British place names to reconstruct was, with the postcode's area and district information, easier to place within a geography, which reduced the range of possible destinations from which the correct one had to be identified. What was changing about the work, and what was not changing? The branch's function did not disappear when the postcode rollout was complete in 1974. The National Return Centre in Belfast, which handles Royal Mail's undeliverable mail today, is the Returned Letter Branch's functional successor, a specialised internal department for the residual category of correspondence that the ordinary sorting and delivery system cannot place. What changed between the tray on the desk on the 3rd floor of King Edward Building in 1932 and the automated sorting systems of the later 20th century was the character of the skill that the work required. The clerk who had spent 17 years accumulating knowledge of British place names in their common misspellings, their county associations, their postal district allocations, who had learned to read the spatial information in a smudged or abbreviated address the way a map reader learns to read contour lines, was doing work that the machine, in its first years, could not replicate. The machine required the code to be correct. The clerk worked with what was incomplete. As the postcode became standard, and as sorting equipment became capable of reading not just codes, but elements of handwritten addresses, the specific manual skill of working through an illegible address became less central to the system's daily operation. The residual category of genuinely undeliverable mail remained. It remains today, but its character shifted from the partly readable address requiring human geographic knowledge to the truly unresolvable case where no amount of human skill could find the destination. The clerk's 17 years of knowledge had been a map of British place names and their common variants, held in a person's memory and available the moment a smudged address arrived in the tray. What the postcode system built, over 15 years of national rollout, was an external version of that map, a standardized, machine-readable address system that reduced the frequency of the problem the clerk had existed to solve. The branch's work had always been invisible. What it had done, for the decades of its operation, was enforce the postal system's own promise that a letter, once posted, would not simply vanish, that the system's failure to deliver on its first attempt was not the letter's final fate. That someone, on the third floor, in a room with no public counter, was working through the tray. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more rounds, more sorting offices, more letters from active service, more emigrant envelopes that arrived at a door where someone had been going to the window every time a red van turned into the street. What the clerk on the third floor did, reading an impossible address and finding, in it, a route, was the work that made the postal system's promise complete. Not the part anyone knew about, the part that quietly kept the correspondence from vanishing. And if you have a letter that arrived late, or redirected, or with a stamp that told you it had been somewhere else before it reached you, put it in the comments. Next on this channel, the women who walked Britain's postal rounds in the First World War. When the postman became the postwoman, and the round did not stop. The National Return Centre in Belfast, which handles Royal Mail's undeliverable mail today, holds on any given day approximately 20 million items that could not be delivered as addressed. Each one was posted. Each one was believed, at the moment of posting, to be addressed correctly enough to arrive. The skill that worked through those cases. In 1932, in a room on the third floor of King Edward Building, with no public counter and no public-facing window, was the knowledge of British place names in their common misspellings, the patience to work through 6 or 8 possible destinations before settling on the most probable, and the specific discipline of stopping at the point where the postal address had been recovered and the authority had run out. What the telephone gave, when it arrived, was the ability to ask the question again immediately. What the letter required, posted to an address that the postal system could not immediately read, was someone on the third floor willing to try to read it. The clerk's tray was never empty. That was the work.